The soft morning sunlight gently illuminated the small street in the southern part of the city, where old, crowded houses created a vibrant yet chaotic living space. The honking of cars, the shouts of street vendors, and the laughter of children mingled with the cries of hawkers, forming the daily symphony of the neighborhood. For Mark Thompson, a police officer with over 15 years of service, it was just another ordinary day. Yet, Mark carried an invisible bias every time he patrolled this area. Mark disliked patrolling this neighborhood. To him, it was a crime hub, a place teeming with swindlers, drug dealers, and irresponsibility. He had grown accustomed to viewing its residents through a lens of suspicion. Stepping out of his patrol car, Mark scanned the surroundings, his eyes moving from person to person. Almost immediately, his gaze settled on an elderly black woman standing outside a small grocery store. She wore a simple floral dress and an old wide-brimmed hat, holding a net bag with a few apples inside. Mark eyed the woman, a vague sense of distrust stirring within him. He walked toward her, his tone firm but laced with a hint of derision. "What are you doing here? Why do you look so sneaky?" The woman turned to face him, startled by his words. Her face bore a calm yet weary expression. "I'm just buying some fruit. Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely. Mark crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Do you have a receipt? Or did you just steal something from the store?" The baseless accusation hit the woman like a punch to her dignity. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just an old lady buying a few apples. If you don't believe me, you can ask the shopkeeper inside." But Mark didn't give her a chance to explain further. In his mind, her weathered appearance and the socioeconomic status of the people in this neighborhood were enough proof that she was hiding something. Mrs. Josephine Green remained standing, neither resisting nor yielding. Onlookers began to gather, curious about the confrontation between the police officer and the elderly woman. Mark grew increasingly irritated as he noticed the judgmental stares of the crowd. He thought he needed to take control to assert his authority. Mark commanded, "Give me the bag. I need to check it." Mrs. Josephine hesitated but eventually handed the bag to Mark. He rummaged through it roughly, causing a few apples to fall to the ground and roll away under the disapproving gaze of the onlookers. A young man in the crowd couldn't hold back and spoke up. "Hey, what are you doing? She's just an old lady buying some groceries. You can't treat her like this." Mark turned to him sharply, barking, "This isn't your business. Stay out of police matters." The young man fell silent but didn't leave. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began recording the scene. Mark ignored him, focusing on finding what he believed to be evidence of a crime. But all he found in the bag were a few apples and a receipt from the store. Mrs. Josephine, her voice trembling but resolute, said, "Now you see? I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you humiliating me like this?" Mark didn't respond, his expression cold and detached. Finally, he issued another command, "Get in the car. We're going to the station to clear this up." Mark's actions ignited outrage among the crowd. Some people shouted, demanding him to stop, but Mark remained unmoved. He believed he was fulfilling his duty, dismissing the protesters as mere troublemakers. The young man continued recording, raising his voice, "I'm posting this video online. Everyone will see how you treat innocent people." Mark turned, his eyes blazing with anger. "You're interfering with an officer on duty. If you don't want to get arrested, you'd better keep quiet." Instead of quieting down, the crowd grew louder. Many began shouting for justice, enraged by the sight of an innocent elderly woman being treated unfairly, seemingly because of the color of her skin. Mrs. Josephine didn't resist as she was pushed into the police car. But inside, a deep sadness welled up in her. She felt not only humiliated but also stripped of her dignity. Silently, she closed her eyes, unwilling to let her weary gaze witness any more injustice. As the police car drove away, The young man immediately uploaded the video to social media with the caption, "A racist cop arrested an innocent elderly woman just because of her skin color. We cannot let this continue." Within hours, the video went viral like a wildfire. Thousands of shares and comments flooded social platforms. Hashtags like #JusticeForJosephine and #EndRacism spread at lightning speed. Major news outlets began covering the story, interviewing witnesses and delving deeper into the incident. Television networks aired the video, making the story a nationwide focal point. Meanwhile, Mark remained oblivious to the storm brewing outside. He was confident that the legal system would shield him as it always had. But what he didn't know was that this time, he had crossed a line he shouldn't have. He had wronged the mother of the Minister of the Interior. Inside the stately office of the Ministry of the Interior, Minister Alan Green was carefully reviewing the morning briefing. His desk, immaculate and orderly, reflected the demeanor of a meticulous and principled man. Alan was known for rarely letting emotions interfere with his work. He remained composed in the face of political storms and media scrutiny. But this morning, an unexpected phone call disrupted his calm. "Minister, there's an urgent matter you need to be aware of." His assistant's anxious voice crackled over the line. "What is it?" Alan asked, his brow furrowing. The assistant hesitated for a few seconds before continuing. "A video showing an act of racial discrimination by a city police officer has gone viral. The victim is an elderly black woman. And she's your mother, Mrs. Josephine Green." Alan froze. He could hardly believe his ears. "My mother? Are you certain?" "We verified it, sir. The video is causing a public outcry." "Sir." Alan leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. For a moment, he felt torn between two identities. A son and a leader. Publicly, he was the head of one of the most critical departments in the country. Privately, he was a son, pained by the humiliation inflicted upon his mother. "Keep this quiet," Alan said firmly. "No one is to reveal the connection between me and my mother. I will handle this personally." Ending the call, Alan stood, his hands braced on the desk, his gaze steely with determination. He knew that this time, justice was not just an abstract concept. It was a fight to defend his mother's dignity. Meanwhile, at the city police department, Mark Thompson went about his daily routine, blissfully unaware of the storm of public outrage brewing against him. He was confident that the incident with Mrs. Josephine was a trivial matter that would soon be forgotten. But everything changed when he received a summons from his superior. "Thompson, report to my office immediately. We need to talk." The police chief's voice crackled over the intercom. Mark walked into the office, only to be met with the chief's stern gaze. On the desk was a laptop, the screen playing the video of the incident he had caused. "Do you know this video has gone viral?" the chief asked, his tone heavy with disapproval. Mark frowned. "What video? I was just doing my job." The chief emphasized every word. "Your job? Humiliating an innocent elderly woman in front of a crowd while being filmed." Mark stubbornly defended himself. "I suspected her of shoplifting. Everything I did was within the scope of the law." "Really?" The chief's voice grew sharper. "Do you think the public will let this slide with that attitude? We've received hundreds of calls and emails from human rights organizations. They're demanding your immediate suspension. And worse, do you even know who that elderly woman is?" Mark raised an eyebrow, unease starting to creep in. "She's the mother of the Minister of the Interior," the chief said, each word cutting through Mark's confidence like a knife. Shock washed over Mark's face. He had never imagined that the woman he had belittled could be connected to someone so powerful. "You're suspended from duty, effective immediately," the chief declared coldly. At the same time, Mrs. Josephine Green, maintaining her usual calm demeanor, sat at the small table in her cozy kitchen. Surrounding her were old books, family photographs, and a serene atmosphere she had always cherished. The phone rang, signaling a call from a reporter. "Mrs. Green," We would love to hear your thoughts on the recent incident. The public is very interested. Josephine paused, quietly contemplating for a long moment before responding. I don't want to make myself the center of attention, but if my words can help others, I will speak out. The next day, she appeared in a televised interview. Despite her age, her eyes were sharp and composed. During the program, she recounted her story in a gentle but powerful tone. I don't wish to turn the injustice I experienced into a fire of anger, but I hope this story will awaken many, not just within the police force but in society as a whole. We need to see each other with our hearts, not through the lens of skin color or prejudice. Her words resonated deeply, like a clarion call to society's conscience. Within hours, the interview went viral, amplifying public outrage against Mark and the system that had enabled such behavior. The video of Mrs. Josephine and her profoundly humane speech sparked a wave of nationwide protests. From major cities to small towns, thousands took to the streets, holding banners that read, "Justice for Josephine" and "No room for racism." Prominent human rights organizations joined in, urging the government to take stronger action. They not only demanded Mark's dismissal but also called for sweeping reforms within the police force. Under immense public pressure, the city's mayor held an emergency press conference, announcing that an independent investigation would be conducted into Mark's actions and those of other officers involved. In his office, Secretary Alan Green closely monitored the unfolding events. He understood that this incident was no longer a personal matter but had become a symbol of the fight against injustice. Alan made a decision, one that weighed heavily on him. Despite the pain, he resolved to let the law take its course. Whispering to himself, as though making a vow to his mother, he said, "I will not let this be forgotten. Justice must prevail not just for you, Mother, but for everyone who has endured injustice." Secretary Alan Green was not someone easily swayed by personal emotions, but this time, he knew he could not stand idly by. Returning to his apartment after a tense day of work, he paused before a family portrait proudly displayed on the wall. In the photograph, Mrs. Josephine Green smiled warmly beside him. Back when he was a young man newly admitted to college, Alan reflected on the struggles his mother had endured. She had raised him on her own in a society rife with prejudice, enduring scornful looks and disparaging remarks simply because of her skin color. From those experiences, she had imparted invaluable lessons to Alan about resilience and compassion. Snapping back to the present, Alan realized that the incident involving his mother was more than just a singular wrongdoing. It was a symptom of a deeper issue, a system that had allowed individuals like Mark Thompson to thrive unchecked. He picked up the phone and called a team of independent investigators, ordering them to expand their probe beyond Mark to encompass the entire city police department. "We need to get to the root of this," Alan said firmly. "We can't let people like that continue to tarnish justice." But Alan didn't stop there. He began organizing meetings with human rights activists and experts on police reform. His goal was not just to hold one person accountable but to transform an unjust system entirely. As public outrage continued to surge, the independent investigation began delving into Mark Thompson's past. In a meeting room at the police department, investigators questioned Mark's colleagues, reviewed old reports, and uncovered stories that had long been buried. A clearer picture of Mark's true nature began to emerge. This wasn't the first time Mark had been accused of racist behavior. Years earlier, he had stopped a black family in their car simply because the car didn't look like it fit them. On another occasion, he had rudely shoved a young black man to the ground for not presenting his ID quickly enough. However, all these incidents had been swept under the rug or reported in a cursory manner. Mark often cited reasons like reasonable suspicion or ensuring public safety. The cover-ups by his colleagues and superiors had emboldened him, allowing his misconduct to escalate over time. But this time, things were different. Under pressure from the public and the Minister of the Interior, no one could shield Mark any longer. A thick file detailing his numerous violations was compiled, and Mark began to feel the tightening grip of the law closing in on him. Mark Thompson was no longer the confident and powerful police officer he once was. After being suspended, he faced a tidal wave of criticism from all sides. Neighbors avoided him, colleagues turned their backs, and even his family began questioning his actions. One evening, Mark sat alone in his small apartment. The television in the corner of the room blared news about the protests sweeping through the city. Josephine Green's face appeared on the screen, her words full of compassion and humanity. Mark stared intently at the screen, feeling as though she was speaking directly to him. Memories of the times he had abused his power and let prejudice guide his actions began flooding back. A heavy weight pressed down on his mind, as if he were being crushed by the weight of his own guilt. Phone calls from the media came in constantly, but Mark couldn't bring himself to answer. Protesters frequently knocked on his door, demanding he take responsibility for his actions. Day by day, Mark felt more and more isolated. He began to wonder, could everything he had believed in all these years have been wrong? Even though he knew he couldn't easily undo his mistakes, Mark decided to do something he had never considered before: face Josephine Green and apologize. Mark reached out to his lawyer, asking them to arrange a meeting with Josephine. At first, she refused. To her, what Mark had done wasn't something that could simply be erased with an apology. But after some thought, she decided to accept the meeting. That day, in a small room at the police station, Mark and Josephine sat across from each other, without his badge or uniform to hide behind. Mark was just a middle-aged man with tired, regretful eyes. Josephine sat upright, her expression calm but firm. "What do you want to say?" she asked evenly. Mark took a deep breath, his throat tightening. I'm sorry. I have no excuse for what I did. I let my prejudices guide me and hurt you. I deeply regret it." Josephine was silent, studying Mark for a long moment before responding. "I don't need your apology. What I need is action. If you're truly sorry, prove it by changing yourself and fighting to ensure no one else has to endure the injustice I faced." Mark lowered his head. Her words pierced him like a blade. He realized that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, and that his journey to redemption would be a long one. Josephine Green was no ordinary woman. Her life was a testament to relentless perseverance, fighting to survive and preserve her dignity in a society riddled with injustice. After her encounter with Mark, memories of the difficult years she had endured came flooding back. Born and raised in the rural South, Josephine was the daughter of a farming family. From a young age, she witnessed her parents bowing their heads to white landowners just to keep the small plot of land that sustained them. Her childhood left little room for grand dreams. They were crushed under the harsh reality of racial discrimination. As she grew older, Josephine resolved to leave her hometown in search of a better life in the city. But there, she faced subtler, yet equally insidious, forms of racism. She was denied housing because of the color of her skin and endured judgmental stares when she entered upscale stores. It became clear to her that she could never escape the shadow of prejudice. Still, she refused to let circumstances defeat her. Josephine became involved in civil rights movements, contributing her small but meaningful efforts to broader societal change. She marched in protests, wrote letters to legislators, and organized community gatherings to raise awareness about equality and justice. She vividly remembered one protest, where she and her comrades peacefully demonstrated, only to be met with police batons. She was struck on the shoulder, leaving a scar that still ached when the weather turned cold. Yet the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional anguish, the deep wound of realizing that no matter how hard she fought, some people would always see her as inferior because of her skin color. But that memory didn't break her. Instead, it made her stronger. For Josephine, every step forward was an act of defiance, and every smile was a declaration that she would never be defeated. The trial of Mark Thompson became a national spectacle. From the early hours of the morning, Hundreds gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding justice. Television reporters crowded the scene, cameras trained on the courthouse doors, capturing each key figure as they entered under a flurry of flashing lights. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Mark sat in the defendant's seat, his face etched with exhaustion and anxiety. Mrs. Josephine Green, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, sat in the witness area, her calm demeanor radiating a quiet strength. The prosecutor began by presenting the now viral video, the shouts of the crowd, Mark's cold and commanding tone, and the images of Josephine being humiliated played on a large screen, leaving the courtroom in a heavy silence. When it was Josephine's turn to testify, she stepped up to the stand with measured grace. In her testimony, she didn't just recount the events of that day but spoke of the pain she had endured throughout her life. "What he did to me that day was not just the action of one individual," she said, her voice steady yet charged with emotion. "It was a manifestation of a system that has existed for far too long, a system that disregards the dignity of people like me. But today, I am not here to seek revenge. I am here to demand change." After several days of deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy as the judge rose, holding the written decision. "Defendant Mark Thompson, we find you guilty of abuse of power and acts of racial discrimination. This court sentences you to 2 years in prison and mandates participation in a compulsory re-education program." The judge declared. The courtroom erupted. Some people clapped, while others quietly nodded in agreement. Mrs. Josephine remained composed, her expression neutral, but inside she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't satisfaction over Mark's imprisonment. It was the realization that justice had, at long last, been served. Mark bowed his head, his eyes red and watery. He offered no excuses, no words of defense. He sat silently, listening to the judgment. Perhaps, for the first time in his life, he truly understood the gravity of the actions he had committed. In the early days of his time in prison, Mark lived in constant torment. He realized he had not only lost his career but also the trust of loved ones and his own sense of self. One day, he received a letter. It was from Mrs. Josephine. Her handwritten words were simple yet profound. "Even though you hurt me, I hope you can find awakening within yourself. Use this time to learn and change." The letter felt like a lifeline for Mark. He began reading books, participating in rehabilitation discussions, and spending time reflecting on his actions. Lessons about fairness, compassion, and the value of human dignity started to resonate deeply within him. Gradually, Mark realized that regret alone was not enough to amend his wrongs. He needed to act to make amends. From that realization, he began writing apology letters, not just to Mrs. Josephine but to others he had wronged in the past. Each letter became a step on the path to reclaiming his humanity. And though he knew forgiveness would not come easily, Mark was determined to dedicate the rest of his life to doing what was right. Mrs. Josephine Green returned to her modest yet loving neighborhood, though her life was forever changed after the incident. She was no longer just a quiet, elderly woman but had become a symbol of resilience and compassion. In the neighborhood, people greeted her with warmer smiles than before. Human rights organizations, local communities, and even young activists sought her out for wisdom. They listened to her stories, not just about the incident with Mark, but about her lifelong struggle against prejudice in a biased society. One day, she received an invitation to speak at a large seminar in the heart of the city. The event's theme was fighting prejudice and building an equal community. Despite her age, Mrs. Josephine agreed to attend. At the seminar, she stepped onto the stage in a simple yet elegant dress. The stage lights illuminated her face, where the lines of age could not hide the vibrant spirit within. "We cannot change what has happened," she began, her warm voice resonating in the silent hall. "But we can learn from our mistakes, from our pain, to build a better future." Applause erupted throughout the venue. Mrs. Josephine had not only touched everyone's hearts, but had also inspired them to act. After the seminar, many young attendees pledged to join social movements, continuing the fight that Mrs. Josephine had devoted her entire life to pursuing. In prison, Mark Thompson gradually adapted to his new life, although he initially felt despondent and powerless. The letters from Mrs. Josephine planted seeds of hope within him. He began to reflect deeply and question himself. Why did I act that way? What led me to become this person? Mark started spending his time reading books about history, human rights, and social justice movements. These pages opened his eyes to the realization that the prejudices he carried were not innate but had been shaped by a distorted societal system. One day, Mark was invited to participate in an educational program within the prison. The program focused on raising awareness about the harm of racial discrimination and fostering a mindset of equality. Mark decided to join, not to reduce his sentence, but because he genuinely wanted to change. During one discussion session, Mark shared his feelings of regret for the first time. I thought I was upholding the law, but in reality, I was only upholding my own misguided prejudices. I hurt people I was supposed to protect. His candid confession moved everyone in the room, some prisoners, who had themselves been victims of injustice, even stood up and applauded. As the days passed, Mark learned not only to forgive himself but also to listen to and understand others. He began to embrace the journey of transformation, realizing that true redemption required more than words. It required action and a commitment to change. After serving his sentence, Mark decided to take a bold step, visiting Mrs. Josephine once more, this time, not to seek forgiveness but to express gratitude and respect. Mark stood in front of Mrs. Josephine's modest house, holding a simple bouquet of flowers. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. When the door opened, Mrs. Josephine stood there, her calm eyes meeting his. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Mark began, his voice trembling. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I just wanted to say, thank you. You gave me the chance to change." Mrs. Josephine looked at him for a long moment, then invited him inside. They sat across from each other at her old wooden table. The atmosphere was awkward at first, but gradually, they began to talk. Mark shared what he had learned during his time in prison, about the lessons he had drawn from his regret and suffering. "You know," Mrs. Josephine said gently, her eyes softening, "forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about giving someone the chance to make things right. I believe you can do that." Their conversation stretched on for hours, and when Mark finally left, he felt as though a part of the heavy burden in his heart had been lifted. The story of Mrs. Josephine and Mark became the centerpiece of national discussions on police reform and social justice. Minister Alan Green announced a series of new policies, including stricter oversight of police conduct, mandatory anti-racism training, and the establishment of an independent agency to handle complaints about abuse of power. Mrs. Josephine continued her involvement in social movements, but this time, she was no longer fighting alone. Young people, human rights organizations, and even individuals like Mark joined the journey to build a better society. Mark, determined to make amends, became an active advocate for justice system reform and community education on the dangers of prejudice. One afternoon, at a large public forum, Mrs. Josephine and Mark stood together on the same stage. Their story, from conflict and pain to reconciliation, served as a powerful testament that, no matter how dark the past, people can find the light if they are willing to take responsibility and change. Mrs. Josephine concluded her speech with a line that resonated deeply with the audience. "We cannot change the world in a single day, but every small action, every heartfelt word, is a brick in the foundation of a more just and compassionate future."